Hello, everyone. Good morning for those of you who are in the United States, and good afternoon for those who are in the Central Asia-Caucasus region or elsewhere. My name is Mahmoud Gazareteli. I'm a senior fellow here at Central Asia-Caucasus Institute at the American Foreign Policy Council. And you are joining our forum discussion about economic outlook for the Central Asia and Caucasus region. Our key speaker today is Mr. Juha Kahkonen, who is a deputy director for Department for Middle East and Central Asia at International Monetary Fund, longtime friend and colleague of ours, who's been the frequent speaker at our events, and we are very delighted that he's able to join us at our first ever online virtual seminar forum discussion. It's been more than a month and a half when we had our last in-person discussion at Central Asia Caucasus Institute, and we are delighted to have you back, not in person, but at least in our virtual session today. Before I'll turn to Juha for his introductory presentation, and by the way, you will see his PowerPoint presentation on your screen. I would like to ask Chairman of Central Asia Caucasus Institute, Dr. Fred Starr, to give us some overview of most recent developments and kind of to set the context of this discussion today. We are all living in very extraordinary times. And while these extraordinary times brought a lot of new challenges, obviously, first of them, the most important one being the challenges to the healthcare and health situation. But some of the other challenges are still around, and they will come back to us once we pass this pandemic. So I think it's good to have this kind of contextual understanding of where we are in the region. And then we'll move to presentation of Mr. Kahkonen. So Fred, would you start please with your introductory remarks?
Well, thank you very much. First, a word about the International Monetary Fund and about Dr. Juha Kahkonen. The IMF has long been a long-term monitoring operation for Central Asia and the Caucasus. But in 2017, it launched its Central Asia Caucasus regional economic outlook. This is a very serious, high quality analysis that's done on an annual basis. Since then, we have worked very closely with Dr. Kahkonen, who has presented all of their reports at the Central Asia Caucasus Institute. We've been honored to have this association because, frankly, these are very authoritative research products. Their most recent one, covering the region of Central Asia and the Caucasus, had included their predictions for 2020. And if I'm not mistaken, the growth rate was 4.5%. I suspect it is not 4.5% today. We're going to hear that updated in light not just of COVID-19, not just the oil plunge, but also in light of many other factors which can be considered secondary effects of these and other developments. Among them is obviously the rate of investment, tax policy. What happens to tax policy under these changed circumstances? What's the fiscal impact of all this? What does this do actually to budgets? What will it do to trade in every direction? Energy policy, my goodness, it's got to be very significant from the standpoint of energy policy. And then let's not forget the topic which we've focused on for many years, and that is intra-regional economic relations. Is this going to promote them? Is this going to retard them? These are the kinds of questions which, after we hear Dr. Kahkonen's presentation on the statistical overview, we want to engage with as closely as possible. These are obviously ongoing issues. We're not going to come up with definitive answers, But I think what we can do is flag the key indicators that we want to watch in the coming period and some of the key implications of what is visible as of now. So, Dr. Kakan.
If I may intervene, Juha, for a second, you can ask questions online and you can email them at askcaci@afpc.org. Again, it's askcaci, meaning Ask CACI, at afpc.org. So, and I'll remind you this email address after Juha is done with his presentation. Juha, floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mamuka, and thanks, Fred, and good morning to everyone and good afternoon. Let's get the presentation on the screen so that we can start. I'll try to be brief so that we can have time for questions. Okay, so these are indeed extraordinary times for the Caucasus and Central Asia region. Next, the world economy is in a crisis and no region has been spared. The region is suffering from two very serious shocks, the COVID-19 pandemic and the sharp drop in oil prices. These have hit both the people and the economies of the region very hard. Next. Starting with the pandemic, there have been about 10,000 cases reported in the region, and these are increasing rapidly. The number is probably an underestimate given the lack of testing. In any case, countries have taken appropriately strong containment measures ranging from travel restrictions, border closures, school closures, lockdowns to emergency declarations. And trade has been disrupted severely. The Silk Road is frozen, and the sectors that have been hurt most tend to be labor intensive, such as services. Business and consumer confidence are down sharply. Next. The oil shock is hurting both oil exporters and importers in the region. Oil prices are now at the lowest level in real terms since the first oil crisis in the 1970s. This is because demand has plummeted, and while supply has come down, especially after the OPEC Plus agreement, it's lagging behind and inventories are still high. And not only are oil prices very low, they are volatile, and there's a great deal of uncertainty about the future oil prices. But no one is predicting a quick return to the levels that we saw just a month or two ago. Next. Countries have, to their credit, taken strong measures in response. The efforts have been made more complicated by the uncertainty about both the nature and duration of the shocks. Next. The responses have appropriately had two main objectives. The first one, to support the healthcare system, and the second one, to support jobs and citizens. And key policy tools have included the containment measures mentioned earlier, support to the public health systems that haven't been that strong to start with, and third, measures to support the economy through targeted fiscal support, exchange rate flexibility, and appropriate monetary policy. And the fourth element has been efforts to maintain access to finance with central banks providing liquidity to banks and banks modifying loan terms so that companies don't get bankrupt during this crisis, which should be temporary after all. Next. So against this very grim background, it's no surprise that the outlook for key economic indicators is also grim for this year. Next. As Fred mentioned, we had projected growth of around 4.5% for the region. This has been downgraded to a negative 1%. There's variation among the countries, but all are suffering. The projections range from -4% for Georgia and the Kyrgyz Republic to 1.8% for Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. The current account balances are in large deficits, especially among oil exporters that are suffering not only from low prices, but also reduced production and export volumes. And fiscal deficits have mushroomed in the countries because of the spending measures that are necessary to support the economy and the health sector. Next. This is the baseline projection, and we probably cannot expect better outcomes, but there are risks that could result if they materialize in worse outcomes and vulnerabilities that are building up. Next. The first vulnerability is health spending, which in the CCA is lower both in terms of amount and efficiency than in comparator countries. And if there were to be a second or third wave of the pandemic, the health systems would be even more under stress. The second vulnerability is the dependence of the CCA countries on either tourism, which has halted, or remittances, which have come down very sharply. Next. And a big vulnerability is the increased debt burden in the region that follows inevitably the increased budget spending. And $10 billion in new debt is being built during 2020, and this at the time when countries are facing large repayments or loans of close to $30 billion. Next. So what are the policy priorities that the IMF advises countries to focus on, and what's the IMF itself doing to support the countries? As a general statement, I can say that we have put all our focus now on crisis work and postponed other work for the time being to make sure that we can provide maximum support to our member countries. Next. The advice we are giving regarding priorities to the countries is first and foremost to limit the human toll of the crisis. This means prioritizing health spending, sparing no expense. If countries do have room in the budget, they can postpone some other spending. If they don't have room, donor support should be mobilized to ensure the adequacy of health spending. The second priority is to limit the economic toll of the crisis. This means easing the impact on households and firms, especially small and medium enterprises. This can be done through fiscal policy, ensuring that social safety nets are adequate, through tax relief, which should be targeted and temporary and transparent, and also similarly for transfers and subsidies. And governments should provide guarantees to loans so that viable companies don't go bankrupt before the recovery starts. And monetary and financial policies should improve access to finance and maintain financial stability. But as the third priority, it's also important for countries to look ahead and see what they can do now to prepare the ground for sustainable and speedy recovery once the crisis is over. And in this regard, it's important not to be tempted by protectionist policies that can result even in food shortages. The financial sector needs to be strengthened. Every policy measure should be done in a way and communicated in a way to restore confidence. And if countries after the crisis have still room in the budgets, it would be wise to use this for stimulus. And of course, countries should seek external assistance, which is much needed at this juncture. Next. Once the crisis is over, there will be a legacy of the crisis, and while there are some opportunities like the increased digitalization during the crisis that has happened by force, there are also many challenges. And one is to make sure that health spending is permanently raised to levels and also levels of efficiency that allows future difficult situations and pandemics to be addressed. The second thing is to strengthen social safety nets, which haven't been fully adequate in the current situation. It's not only in the CCA, but all around the world, where especially actors in the informal sector have been difficult to reach. I mean, if households and enterprises aren't registered and in the tax net, it's much more difficult to channel assistance to them, and they are suffering as much as actors in the formal sector. Ensuring debt sustainability and good monetary and financial policies was mentioned earlier, but let me mention reform efforts that may suffer in the current situation. And it's understandable that in a crisis like this, the state assumes a larger role than before. And this is good and appropriate temporarily, but after the crisis, the state should step back and allow the private sector to be the engine of growth, and reforms to support that should continue. Another victim, possible victim of the shocks is regional and multilateral cooperation, and it will be more needed than ever when the crisis is over, and I hope both the regional and global atmosphere will be welcoming to it. Next. The IMF is supporting the countries in 4 ways. First, we have been providing rapid financing to countries that have requested it. And the Kyrgyz Republic was the first IMF member country to get this financing a few weeks ago in record time. And we have requests from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan being processed and likely to be approved in the next week or 2. We also had countries, namely Armenia and Georgia, that already had well-performing programs before the crisis. And we are topping up the financing to these countries, and this topping up will be approved in the next couple of weeks. Then we are supporting the countries through policy advice. We are in very close touch with all of the 8 countries, and we are doing it both bilaterally and through regional video conferences. And finally, we are working very closely and coordinating with our partner institutions to make sure that we are all moving in the same direction and creating synergy from our efforts. Next. So that's the end of my presentation, and I very much look forward to questions and comments from you.
Excellent, Juhas. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions now, and we'll start with, maybe I'll give you a couple of questions in the beginning, and then we'll come back with an additional bunch of questions. Number 1 is that you, in general, IMF's economic outlook for 2021 is still very optimistic. While this year it's -4 for world outlook, as I recall, the next year is still more than 5% growth expected. So if you could comment on that, and so you expect this to be kind of a reflection on current decline, and so the expected growth will come from that lower point. Second question is about stability of the currencies in the region. They all were in their balance of payment. They were heavily dependent on, obviously, remittances, tourism incomes, some of the exports, obviously for oil-producing countries, but even others. So what will happen with the stability of the currencies? What's your expectation on that? Our colleague from American Foreign Policy Council, Mr. Ilan Berman, has this question for you. As part of the pandemic, global public opinion regarding China and engagement, both political, economic, with the People's Republic of China is changing pretty significantly. Are you seeing this in Central Asia as well? And how is this likely to impact the investment into the region and economic activity there over time? If you could comment on that. Why don't we start with these questions first, and then we'll come back to others.
Yep, thanks, Mamuka. So on the projections, for the CCA, but also for other countries, the presumption is that this quarter and the next quarter through early fall are the worst period of the crisis. And after that, there will be a gradual recovery that would gain speed next year. And if this materializes, the growth numbers next year should be decent because of the low base. But the truth of the matter would still be that countries would have lost permanently easily some 5% of their GDP. And for the CCA region, that's $35 billion. But whether this is optimistic remains to be seen. As I indicated, there are many risks. and if there are new waves of the pandemic, the containment measures might be reintroduced at some point, and that would obviously deal another blow to growth. So this is our best guess right now, but we acknowledge that risks are really practically all on the downside. On the exchange rates, the big achievement of the region after the oil prices came down in 5 years ago or so was that many moved to more exchange rate flexibility, and this has been a helpful shock absorber to the countries, and many countries have allowed exchange rates to move also during this crisis. Now, one needs to be careful to make sure that this does not cause instability and that the movements do not become uncontrolled. And so some mix of allowing the exchange rate move and intervention by the central banks to make sure that there's reasonable stability in the markets is appropriate. Now, on China's role, it obviously has been a big player in investment and trade in the region. Now the trade channel is closed, and as I mentioned, the Silk Road is not operating for the time being. The countries will need to assess the situations for themselves. There are reports that some countries like the Kyrgyz Republic are negotiating about possible restructuring of their loans with China, but certainly the investment environment after the crisis will be different, and many other players than China may also need to reassess their strategy, just like CCA countries will need to do.
Perfect, thanks, Juha. So now another bunch of questions. I have a question, and it also reflects some other our participants' questions as well. Obviously, low oil prices are tremendous pressure on the region and both producing countries, but also neighboring countries who were accustomed to investments from oil producing, oil exporting countries. So I remember about 20 years ago, some of us who are old enough to remember what happened in late 90s, early 2000s with the low oil prices, let's say in Russia, that stimulated some of the economic reforms until oil prices started to grow again in 2002, 2003, and the Russian policy started to change, economic policies. Where do you see room right now for oil-producing countries in terms of their economic reforms? And do you see kind of now this process somehow accelerating? We've heard many times from different leaders that their intention is to diversify from oil economy. This is perfect chance. So how would you assess these realities? Now, a couple of other questions from our YouTube channel. One is, how will health spending affect military spending? I don't know, I'm not sure whether you want to comment on that or not, but it's your prerogative. How will health spending again affect military spending? Another question is, it relates to, what about increasing donor dependency? So do you expect that there will be countries now more dependent on donors going forward? And whether this is, first of all, how coordinated is effort between the donors at this stage? You mentioned it briefly, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that. Thank you.
Thanks. So on lower oil prices, I mean, these can indeed provide impetus to reforms, especially toward diversification. And this is what we may see in the aftermath or the crisis. I think right now countries are just too focused on the immediate challenges to move in that direction. I should also note that this diversification is not unproblematic in the current situation. For example, the UAE is the most diversified country in the Gulf, and they have been very successful during normal periods, but their diversification has been to some extent in areas that are labor intensive and service related, and these sectors are now suffering. And so in addition from suffering from low oil prices, the diversified part of the economy is also suffering. Now, that should not discourage countries from pursuing diversification, because it's good to have eggs in different baskets, but there can be occasions like this where this can be an issue. On spending, so countries need
if I may
to
intervene for a second. I think you are touching something that your screen is sometimes bigger and sometimes smaller. Sorry to intervene, so just go ahead. Maybe.
Yeah, it's automatic. I can't control it right now.
Okay,
So,
good.
Yeah,
that makes it interesting to watch then.
yeah, or don't watch. So yeah, but so on where one can find room for health spending, obviously countries need to figure out what their priorities are. Military spending is not very transparent in many countries, so it's difficult to know whether that's being reduced or postponed to create room. But many countries typically do have lower priority spending in the traditional areas that can be postponed, and that's what we certainly have seen in the region. Can you remind me of the third question?
It was about donor coordination and donor dependency potentially.
Yeah, so at this point, countries need to be very much in touch with donors, and I think being dependent on donors during the crisis is a good thing. The issue is how countries could become more self-standing after the crisis, and this is certainly something that donors and international financial institutions worry about. And I must say that the coordination, especially for the CCA, has been extraordinarily good, and I hope it will continue. And there are some countries in the region where actually there's, if anything, too much financing that is on offer.
Okay, a couple of other questions maybe. One is, you mentioned liquidity support and through central banks, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. In general, if you could share with us, approach is mostly, you mentioned about your priorities, about focusing on healthcare first and then moving to other activities. So where you see our country's priorities obviously are most probably following that that pattern as well. But in addition to like the focus on healthcare, is focus mostly in all countries on social spending and supporting households, or is it more focused on supporting businesses and employment? As we all know, employment is a most important issue for entire region, causing many other problems and issues. So that's what, maybe we can combine this liquidity-related question and and policy focus in this next bunch of answers? Thank you.
Yeah, so both the liquidity measures and support to households and companies should be from the point of view of trying to make sure that this severe but still temporary crisis will not result in permanent damage to the economies. And so central banks need to make sure that viable banks do get sufficient funding to keep them afloat until the recovery starts. And similarly, both households and companies, especially SMEs, need support to make sure that companies don't go bankrupt or households will not go bankrupt during this period. So there needs to be a very broad-based support throughout the economic system to prevent the temporary shock from doing permanent damage.
Thank you. Our next question is with regard to informal economy. Region is obviously is known for a significant portion of economy being beyond formal sort of framework. And what do you think will be happening with that sort of legalization of economy, process of that, and then what type of policy responses you expect there will be, at least advice to countries from IMF and other donor institutions to bring informal sector economy under formal sort of framework?
Yeah, thanks. As I mentioned, the crisis has shown that it's not so easy to channel assistance to the informal sector. And it's understandable that that's the case, but it doesn't mean that one shouldn't make efforts in that regard. There's some thinking in our institutions, in other institutions, on how that might be addressed, and one idea would be to have things like universal basic income that would go then both to the informal and formal sector, but I think at this point we are more at the stage of being clear that there's a problem rather than finding full and clear solutions.
There is one question, like a follow-up question on earlier discussion about low oil prices and policy sort of driven from that that new reality. The question is like, shall we expect that in at least in the short run, because of the severity of the crisis and the policy priority that you outlined, that we shouldn't expect in oil producing countries any immediate diversification in a short run?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to diversify when the economy is in lockdown, and when the firefighting to address the human and economic consequences of the crisis has to be the priority. But there's certainly the risk that some of the structures that have been created temporarily will be cemented, and this would make reforms more difficult. So while it would be good for reforms to take place, and some countries like Georgia are moving ahead even during the challenges from the crisis, for oil exporters, it's probably difficult to do that until they have some breathing room.
And one more question with regard to one of the points you made in your presentation about intra-regional trade. And obviously there is a decline in trade, significant and drastic decline in trade. We had, with some reforms emerging in 2016-17 in Uzbekistan, and the changing of not just internal policies, but also external openness of country to trade and investments and so forth. There was a very positive momentum in the region. And now we are in a sort of reversal. And you mentioned earlier protectionism by some countries. So can you elaborate a little bit more on that? You know, countries that are more dependent on donors and support, and IMF in particular, they may be more compliant to some of the policies that you advise them, but others who are not borrowing at this particular moment from IMF may be inclined to do more protectionist policies. So where you think that status of this picture is at this point?
Yeah, so currently when borders are closed and trade is limited, obviously integration efforts are on pause, but the efforts that were made before the crisis have not been wasted. I mean, certainly Uzbekistan has become more open, and that benefited the region and put it in a better shape to face this crisis. And unless the opening up is reversed, the situation will be quite promising for the region. I mean, I would expect the border closures and limited trade to be reversed in due course, and then it's really up to the governments to welcome further regional integration, and certainly the IMF and other partners will be encouraging the countries to move to that path.
Raise a question.
Yes, Fred.
This is all taking place at a very high altitude. We're talking about a lot of countries that are very different in many respects. And we're talking about it as a single entity, which is fair enough. And I respect that. That said, they've followed apparently quite different tactics among them in handling this, just as within Europe, for example, you see very different tactics in, say, Sweden, Germany, and Italy, to take three. And there are real outliers within this region in terms of their tactics and in terms of their openness to share their approaches with the world. Are these irrelevant, or should we just look at all this from a very high altitude and neglect these differences?
Clearly, there are the differences you mentioned, and I don't think they are any larger than when one looks at Europe, where there's a wide variety of responses and also COVID-19 situations. We are not health experts. We are observing what's being reported and what the officials tell us. And I think all countries have appropriately taken containment measures. It remains to be seen how effective they are, and this is still early in the game, and it's difficult, I'm sure, also for health experts to have a comprehensive assessment. I would hope that countries would be transparent about the situation, so that also any external advice could be as accurate as possible.
But the differences in approach, I'm not asking you to address them as a public health specialist, but as an economist. The differences in approach produce profoundly different economic fallout, as is the case in Europe. And where do we put these? Where do we put these countries on that scale, both as a region and individually? Are there countries within the region that are following policies that are going to contain future debt, and are there others that are pursuing strategies that will enhance and deepen debt?
Yeah, I mean, I think no country is handling the crisis badly, but we are talking about the stage of the crisis when the house is on fire, and then you don't spare water, so you use as much water as is needed, and there will be some legacy of the crisis, but it would be wrong to be penny pinching at this point just because of debt sustainability. Now things will change and the priorities will change, and countries that have used their spending efficiently will be in the best situation, but now is the time to act very strongly to address the very severe consequences of this extraordinary crisis.
You have a couple more questions, and then probably we'll wrap up with Fred's comments. One question is about, I mean, in times like this, there's always like ideological discussions and whether states' role should be increasing or decreasing, tax rate should be going higher or lower, and maybe, I mean, there are questions about what should be the approach. Maybe allow business with carry less tax burden at this stage in order to allow them to invest more. And so, what's IMF's attitude to this, and your advice on that to countries at this stage? And there was a second question, which probably will dedicate another special event about Eurasian Economic Union, how Eurasian Economic Union has, obviously Russia is trying to use every opportunity to expand that organization. But what's your sort of view on regional economic unions like that, and particularly when it's when it's Russian-centered organization? If you could comment on that as well. So these last two maybe comments, and then maybe I'll ask Fred to his concluding remarks.
Thanks, Mamuka. On the state's role, I mean, we very much support an enhanced role of the state at this juncture. Tax relief is appropriate, more subsidies is appropriate, transfers, loan guarantees, and so on. But all these measures should satisfy the 4 T's. They should be timely, temporary, targeted to those who need the help, and finally transparent. And regarding transparency, the IMF is requiring in this rapid financing for countries to commit to audits of how the money has been spent. So if there's increased health spending, other spending, that it has gone where it was meant to go. And of course, this will safeguard the public finances going forward. On the Eurasian Economic Union, I mean, in our interactions, their financing arm for budget support, namely the Eurasian Fund for Stability and Development, has been a very close and helpful partner, and their views and approach have been very much in line with those of other partners, and they actually are more generally part of the IMF coordinated high-level meetings of the regional financial institutions.
Excellent, thank you. Why don't we ask now Fred to make like 4 or 5 minutes comments, and then maybe your concluding 1 or 2 minutes later on, Juha. Fred, please, you are on mute.
This has been very interesting, and I think the high stratospheric approach that the IMF takes on these matters brings real insights that we wouldn't get simply by collecting details on what's going on country by country. So it's very useful to take this big approach, and obviously we're grateful to the IMF and to Dr. Kakkonen for this. Let me raise just a couple of questions. I want to return first to the issue of tactics. This isn't a medical question, Jess. It's also an economic question, fundamental. Some tactics that could be followed produce much less debt in the future, much more production in the future, and even in the short run than others. And I think some clarity on the different approaches that are being taken throughout the region would be useful. I'm not suggesting that the IMF should assemble those data. I'm suggesting that interested specialists around the world should be looking at that very closely. Second, the issue of debt has come up over and over again, and rightly so. But let me just remind you that we went through a year or two ago an extended period of hand-wringing about debt that some Central Asian countries and Caucasus countries were incurring in connection with the Belt and Road Initiative. And there was a lot of speculation. How much is it? Which countries? How will they be able to handle it? And so on. Well, if that was important then, surely the added debt that is piling up now is something that needs further analysis, using as a base the IMF data. Now on that question, there are a lot of directions that one could go, but I think some real careful country by country analysis is important. For example, Uzbekistan for decades was fiercely opposed to racking up international debt. How are they going to do this time? What's it going to look like in a year or two? Is this a fundamental change there? So that's the second issue. The third issue that I would want to raise is which has been touched upon in a very interesting way already, and rather optimistically, I have to say, by Mr. Kakkonen, is the regional question. And this is, hats off to the IMF for encouraging this, but it's a very concrete thing. What data do we have on actual trade across specific borders? Is it down? Is it up? What's going to happen to it? What are policies in each country doing that will affect this? If we end up dropping back 2 or 3 years on the regional issue, this will be a tremendous loss and an enduring one. Final issue I would raise is the one that Dr. Kakkonen just at the end touched upon again, and that is the international financial institutions, and in general, how does this change the position, the status, the role of Central Asia countries and Caucasus countries in the world? Aside from making them more inward, more outward looking, that's a key question. The question is what is their effectiveness? Are they going to be petitioners more in that role as a result of this, or are they going to be in any sense a model And will this strengthen their hand? Well, these are questions that go well beyond our purposes today, but the value of today's presentation and today's discussion, interesting questions from around the world, the value of that is, of course, is that it gives us a baseline. It gives us a very solid and reliable starting point. And for that, once again, we're deeply grateful to Dr. Kakkonen and to the IMF.
Thank you, Fred. Juha, you want to make a few comments in the conclusion?
Yeah. So on Fred's points, we fully agree that one needs to worry about the quality of spending, and that's why we emphasize the 4 T's and have these audits that countries need to commit to. On debt, the IMF would never be reckless about debt, but in this situation, the governments need to spend more money and hopefully as effectively as they can, but debt levels will go up. This will be a challenge going forward, and it's not going to be easy to address these problems going forward, and many countries will need to be more thrifty than they had planned. And regional integration and outward orientation remain a must for the region, but will be difficult to achieve. Currently, the borders are pretty much closed. Trade is greatly diminished. The borders will open, trade will resume, and we should all make efforts to make sure that the integration will increase, not decrease. I'm very happy that the Caucasus Central Asia Institute has once again organized this event. Your institution is a very important player in this field, and we in the IMF greatly appreciate the close engagement and will be happy to continue it going forward. So thank you so much, and thank you very much for the invisible audience and the good questions.
Thank you, Juha. I appreciate your time and participation definitely today. We definitely take you on your word, and hopefully your regular participation in our events will continue. We expect next outlook for our region sometime in October, as I recall, October, November, and then maybe we'll plan another session, hopefully in person, but if not, it looks like a very successful platform for organizing events. I would like to also mention that in 2-3 weeks, we will organize our next forum discussion focused around Eurasian Economic Union activities in the region and overall multilateral kind of framework for regional countries in terms of their alliances, economic alliances, and the trade, and both intra-regional and extra-regional trade and economic interrelationships. So with that, I would like to thank all our participants, first of all, but also people who are watching us elsewhere in the world, in the United States, of course, and we'll be in touch with our announcements for the future events. Thank you all. Have a good day or good evening, depending where you are. Thanks, Juha, again. Thanks, Fred. Thanks, Stephanie, for your support and help.
Thank you.